Hello. Hey. Thank you so much for coming. It's really great to be here, and we're going to talk tonight about shared component libraries. So hopefully that sounds at least mildly interesting or sort of what you were expecting, and if not, I won't be offended at all. There's lots of good pizza to hang out and eat. So shared component libraries, or how to reuse front-end code and keep your sanity. There are a lot of really great things that we can do with shared components and reusing our front-end code, and there's also a lot of ways where you can slowly lose your sanity and it can go really wrong. So we're going to start with some of the problems that it solves. We're going to go into some of the issues you might run across, and then finally we'll talk about some of the tips and tricks we've learned at Politico. My name's Jack. I'm a front-end developer at Politico. There we work primarily with Vue. It's our front-end framework of choice. We use a lot of TypeScript. I've liked working with React and general JavaScript. Because this is on the board and sort of to get some insight into the experience of people working here, a couple of quick questions that might help target the talk a little bit. First of all, just show of hands, who's worked with any front-end framework that uses components? Cool, awesome. Now we'll break it down real quick. Who's worked with React? Awesome. Angular, either of the Angulars. Nice. Vue? There are dozens of us. Anyone with Ember? Cool. And then web components or Polymer? Awesome. So it's great to see that I would say the vast majority of us have some experience with that, because this talk and the philosophies of working with web components, working with a shared component library really apply if you're using any of those tools, because it's about making something work across products. It doesn't matter what particular technology or framework you're using. This is, in case you've never seen what a component is, this is just like the real quick intro of kind of what we're going to be talking about. We have a drop down here and the code for it. Beneath it, the idea of a component being you pass in some information and you watch for events that get emitted. And for a shared component library, it's kind of we try to keep it roughly that simple. And so when we're talking about components, this is just sort of an example of something to keep in mind. The rough schedule. We're here for theoretically 60 minutes if all goes according to plan and not everyone walks out. And so it's a long time. If you have any questions, please ask. So I can take a sip of water while you're asking, or so people get less bored. We're going to start with the problem. We have in front-end development, often we run across UI patterns that are either inconsistent, and there's a slight difference in padding that's immensely frustrating. They're duplicated. We have the code that does roughly the exact same thing in multiple places or across multiple products, and it's really frustrating that we have to rewrite it each time, and if we have to make a fix, that we have to go make the fix in multiple places. And it's scattered, and it's tough to keep track of what code we have available, like what have we written already that could solve this problem, especially now that front-end teams more generally have started thinking in terms of atomic design or design that can easily break down into components. We often have in mind, I just need this select, and so it's really frustrating when we don't have that option. So the solution, shockingly based on the talk title, we're going to talk about shared component libraries. And then we're going to talk about the implementation, and this is really this sounds great, but there's also lots of ways it can go wrong, so we're going to talk about some of the things, including the various frameworks that make this work, Storybook for developing and viewing your components. I'm going to talk about how NPM can help you version and manage the shared library that you're going to share across products. We're going to talk about TypeScript and documentation, and we're all going to take a big sigh of relief that it's over. So starting with the problem, who's had, I'm going to list off three, well, it's the problems I listed off, three issues. Either your front-end code is inconsistent, your front-end code is duplicated in lots of places, or your front-end code is scattered. Show of hands, who's had at least one of those? Who's had all three? Cool. So this is relevant, the problem that we're trying to solve. What, in this instance, are we running away from? What are some examples, not just like saying, oh, my code's scattered, because that's easy for software developers to say is like, this is frustrating and I can't deal with it. So we'll look at some concrete examples of what it is we're running from. Not to name names of specific websites, but we're at a non-meetup event right now, so this is fine. Who's been on meetup.com recently? I don't know if you've noticed, there are vast portions of meetup.com that are still their old design. So this is a little bit of a low blow because they are doing things to make it more modern. And so the two examples I have here are across two different versions of their site, but you can get to both of them right now. So on the left is sort of your main page, and we're looking at this create event button. And what it's doing functionally is one unit of work, or one component, one unit of functionality and visuals on the page, which is I want to click a button and see all the actions that are available related to the button. And it's really nice. You'll notice as a benefit here, the way they have this laid out, it lends itself quite nicely to an animation. You can imagine it flowing in either from the top or maybe lifting up from the bottom, but because it's separated but related to the create event button. And then on the right is before they're redesigned. If you happen to click on view members of a meetup, you'll get taken back to something that looks old. But it's the same exact functionality. I click on group tools. Well, from their design, it's not super obvious. Maybe it's a hover, maybe it's a click. But I see the options that are related to that main button. So it's the same exact functionality, but the downside for Meetup is that as a user, I might get confused. It may feel uncomfortable or weird to switch between these two experiences. As a company, I don't get the, as Meetup, I don't get the credibility of having a modern and consistent interface that I get to associate with my brand. They don't really deserve it right now. And then as a development and a design team, you really start to lose steam when you have to make these differentiations all the time. So if I'm going to create a new drop-down, fold-down component, which one do I use and where do I look for advice on the implementation of that? Another example, to name names, Venmo has a really nice application for your phone, a really modern looking search interface where you can see that each of these things here is a component. We have a component here where the items involved are profile picture, a nice circle. The biggest thing that you'll see is the name of the person, and then you'll see the username, and it's really tight and works well both across search and any other place you're on the Venmo application. And then if you go to the web view, it's really not that, and it's much less modern looking, and it's also confusing to look at this and try to figure out what the parentheses mean. It doesn't match your typical experience. So it's the same issues for Venmo that they're not going to get the consistent brand image that they're looking for. And finally, because we're naming names, I want to call out myself, or our team, I suppose. Politico Pro has some products. One of them on the left is a congressional directory. One of the drop-downs involved with, one of the multi-selects with congressional directories if you want to select the session of Congress that you're interested in while you're searching for someone. And it works. It's fine. It was an older iteration. But on the right, we also have a product to search for documents related to legislation. It's the same exact component, and it looks drastically different. And there are functional and accessibility differences here that we now have the press center to select that wasn't there previously. But certainly, especially for Politico, where you want people to know that you're using your product, this really sucks because it's no longer obvious that these are two products from the same company. And especially if we just want to design and develop the functionality once and then get to use it again, we're really missing that because these are totally different. Does this look familiar to anyone?
Yes.
Yes. What is it? Who said yes?
That, do you see it, the UI thinking is which one is the better UI?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. It's called can'tunsee.space. If you get bored and instead of leaving you want to do something else, go here. It'll take you like 10 minutes. I was wondering if this was going to be high enough resolution. Just out of curiosity, does anyone see the issue top to bottom here?
Yes.
Yeah, what you got?
The first one, the contrast is too low on the second, on 2 hours ago. And the second one, the camera is on the bottom one is not on the bottom.
Nice. I think that's exactly right. Very good. So the problem that we're looking at here is that this component is a card. It is maybe a call to action card or a feature card or something like that. But it should only be done once. We should only need to have the discussion with our designer about the padding and the margins and the colors and the contrast. We should only need to have that once, and then we should get to use it anywhere. But in this case, you could imagine that if it's developed from scratch each time, you might run into inconsistencies. Same thing here. This is sort of the pre-frameworks way of dealing with front-end code, which is that you try to write classes, you try to write your CSS classes in a way that will match the architecture of your page, if you will. And so you try to write a generic button class, and then you try to write a button small class that you'll apply to the button. But then very quickly, I don't know if anyone else, again, maybe a little bit hard to read. Does anyone want to point out one or two things that's different on the right side? It's totally fine if the answer is no. This is not the important part. I'll just highlight them. It doesn't really matter, but you could imagine that one developer approaches it the way on the left, and this other developer comes in, sees the same exact spec, but they design it with flex, and they create slightly different padding for their button small, and they create a different class. And so you imagine with CSS not centralized, or sorry, not coupled to the places it's being used, you very quickly lose track of where you should be making your changes and finding out what other people have created. Okay, the very last example of what we're running away from. At Politico, we've switched to using inline SVGs, which is great. There are lots of really good things about being able to animate inline SVGs, but we were getting those from our designers, and then we were pasting them into our HTML code or into our view code, and so you would have this along with lots of other real functionality. And it would be both a drain kind of on a drain on your understanding of what's going on in a given file, and also an immense drain if this ever changes. This happens to be, this happens to be a profile icon. You would have never known that from looking at it. But if the profile icon slightly changes next time, we're never going to be able to keep track of which ones have updated profile icons because no one can read this. It's just magic. Okay, so these are the things we're running away from, like Pirates of the Caribbean running away from. We're running away from inconsistent experiences. We'd love to avoid duplicate code. We'd love to avoid overly verbose code the way that SVG was. We'd love to avoid scattered knowledge, where someone has done something and created something, and we lose track of it, and we just forget about it until it shows up that now we have 6 versions of the same thing. And we'd like to avoid the can't unsee. We'd like to avoid rehashing those design decisions that we should really only need to make once. So the things that we're running towards, who knows what this is? Yeah, what is it?
This thing where it's impossible to win.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, that's how I think the vast majority of us experience it. You can find videos of people running at QuAP, but it's an impossible game. So this is I think there are lots of Google products that have issues of consistency, but in just looking at a couple of the web ones that I do use, this is great. And so I want to highlight how you could imagine that these may or may not be, but work as standalone components. So we have on the left, you could imagine a component called hamburger button. Its only job is to look like a hamburger button, probably to animate when you click it, and then to say, like, I've been clicked, or I'm active, or things like that. But you create it once, and then you get to use it in lots of places. For example, contacts in Gmail. The button, you need to keep consistent spacing, padding, font size, an icon, and then, of course, the icon for the application itself. Another thing that a component can be responsible for is functionality. In this case, animations, still probably done with CSS, but there's lots of cases where you want a component to be responsible for some microcosm of functionality. You want it to take in data and do something, or you want it to accept user input and do something. With can't unsee, we could imagine that these things that we're trying to keep consistent, instead of having them be something that you develop each time, maybe on the left we have a user status component. So it accepts properties for the name and the time and an image, and then it will display based on whatever dynamic data you give it. Same on the right, maybe it's something called action card. You have a headline and an action and an icon that you want, and then you also pass in the general content. And just to make sure, generally this pattern looks familiar, correct? It's how a lot of us experience writing front-end code today. Same thing, by avoiding having our CSS separated from the markup that's creating our interfaces, if we can keep it coupled with the markup and bundle that into a component that can be shared across a project or across multiple products, we get a base button, perhaps, that accepts a size property. I'm trying to avoid buttons mostly in this talk because anyone who talks about component libraries is the easiest thing to go to, and I know I've already done it 2 or 3 times, but I'm going to try to avoid it for most. You know, a button is a good example of something that we hate doing over and over and over again, and slight inconsistencies. So if we can bundle the HTML, any JavaScript necessary, and the CSS together, it makes it really easy to use. Finally, if we want to avoid this incredibly verbose and unreadable inline SVG, if we can create, in our case, a Politico icon component that only needs to accept a name property, all of a sudden this is all that shows up in your interface when you want to have an icon in your header, or you want to have an icon on your nav. You don't have to get distracted by trying to maintain 60 different 40-line SVGs. And you just have Politico icon. And this, honestly, like, buttons are great, but this has been the greatest thing for us, and probably has the heaviest usage in our shared component library. So these are the things we'd love to avoid. So now we go towards the solution. What we're going to talk about for shared components is the happy path of things going well, and we're also going to talk about the scary obstacles, so that we can be aware of both and talk about techniques to help us maximize the good things and minimize the bad things. The previous approaches to this, so you could imagine, and I'm far from an expert on web history, but you could imagine that before we had single page applications, so before we loaded most, if not all, of our code on the first load of the page, and then we're able to interact with the site in a way where the functionality was managed a lot by the front-end team, you would have code that, you made a request each time for a new page. You would maybe get some templates, and so you would break things out that way and try to make them reusable. But without a way to organize our code into, people have probably heard of atomic design or the things that followed it, where you talk about the smallest element and then you combine some of those into, maybe it's molecules, and then you combine those into organisms, and then your metaphors totally break down and you go to templates, and it's really annoying. Before that, at that point where you were just using HTML and CSS, often they were totally separate, and it was tough to figure out which parts related to each other, and so therefore it can be tough to maintain that. And so what does CSS stand for? Yep, yeah, so it's hard to track the cascade if you're trying to reuse code. It's hard to track what things are actually going to affect this at any given time. A goal would be that if you have components, you can know exactly what's going to affect that individual component. They live separately. Alternatively, if you're not trying to share CSS files, which can get very difficult, then maybe you just try to maintain a style guide. A line from a book called Clean Code that I liked a lot is that code doesn't lie and comments can lie. And so if it's ever possible to have your documentation be your code or self-documented code, if it's feasible for you to do that, it's an incredibly maintainable approach. And a style guide, which is just documentation somewhere, can quickly become out of sync with the way that you're actually using, using your code or your shared resources. So today we have shared component libraries. We also will hear things like this referred to as pattern libraries or design systems, probably lots of other words as well. I've decided to focus on the component aspect because we're talking about how we can break up our code into components and import those into projects. You can imagine if, for example, you don't want to actually share the code, but you're trying to track sort of your philosophy as a company. That could be something that you'd call maybe a pattern library of these are the patterns that we put together. But I wanted to focus on how we're actually going to be sharing the code. Some really, really good examples and popular examples. Shopify, which we'll be talking about a decent amount here because they've done a fantastic job, has what they call Polaris, which is their component library. They maintain a version that is HTML and CSS, but the primary way people use it is as React components. And VMware has what they call Clarity, and theirs is an Angular component library. These are, I would say, two of the most popular, where it was originally for a company and then open sourced for people to use as they see fit. A third example that has a decent amount of popularity is IBM's design system and component library. They call it Carbon. Something that Carbon does extremely well is versioning, in that what you're looking at here is their beta version that they make available for you to look at, but they're saying this isn't ready yet. And that's something we're going to talk about. Is one of the biggest pain points is how do you version your library, especially as you increase the number of teammates or the number of teams that will be referencing it. It gets very important to have a consistent versioning strategy. Here's Shopify's Polaris, and you'll see we'll look at this site a little bit. It's incredibly well done. It's, I think, more well done than anything that you'll work on at your company ever needs to be for the vast majority of time. Because you're not worried about public consumption, you're worried about how do I make sure that the documentation is always up to date. You want to make sure it's very readable and approachable, but Shopify has done a particularly good job of auto-generating a lot of this in a really readable way. Any questions? I'm going to take a sip of water just in case anyone has any questions. Cool. So the things we're gonna that we've talked about wanting to avoid: component libraries, tired and wired. We can enforce a consistent experience. We can create a single source of truth in the code that people know they can reference. We can make code more readable. We can centralize and share our knowledge, so you have the place where you need to go if you want to find out, has this thing been done already? And finally, we can allow the design decisions to be made once. But, a quote from my boss: reuse is hard. That was, as we were initially starting our component library, we had many discussions about why this is going to be worthwhile. The people who were on the front-end team well before I was had been pushing it, because we recognized that we were going to start to have more products that were either going to be in different repositories or calling different backends organized separately, and we needed a place where we could capture all the stuff that we'd already started doing a bunch, that we'd already reproduced too many times, and so we wanted and felt we needed a component library. And at one of the initial meetings, the essential takeaway quote is reuse is hard. So the happy path things that we talked about. I'm going to go on to the scary obstacles, but I think this is maybe it's something you've already thought about or something you've attempted, and so I'd love to hear here at this point anything that you can think of that sharing code across teams or across your company, sharing front-end code, what are the risks or what are some of the obstacles? Any thoughts? Yeah. People don't know how to use them. Yeah, that is an excellent point. People come to it and see maybe exactly what you would expect to see because you're the one who developed it, and they come to it and get scared of it. Either they use it wrong, which can be bad, or they don't use it at all, and if that happens enough and they make their own thing, then your component library won't have any longevity. Any other thoughts? Yeah.
Slightly different brands that you need overrides for.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. If you have what your team has needed, and you don't know exactly what someone else is going to need, and all of a sudden they need slight tweaks to it, or they need slight tweaks to everything, different colors, different stuff like that. Yeah, definitely overrides. Is there one more? Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Designing it to be flexible. This is part of that, of designing it to be flexible. If your component library is going to have longevity, so in the same way that we want an open source project, right? For it to have longevity, there need to be people using it, because if no one's using it, then the 6 people who do use it are going to be constantly running into issues, but there's going to be no community, no people who are invested enough in fixing it, and so people are going to move on to other things. If you don't get buy-in from your company or your team, you're going to quickly find that it's not being maintained. You get friction while modifying, again, kind of with flexibility. You create the components that you want to use across products. You create them initially with some idea in mind, and you have then the issue of if there's a significantly different use case that you didn't anticipate and you need to make major changes to it, maybe you need to make a change that will break previous usage, then trying to communicate that to people, trying to handle the versioning, trying to make changes in a way that don't affect other projects can be pretty difficult. Along with that, versioning challenges of how do you manage your kind of philosophy of versioning your component library. And finally, you really need, and this was at the beginning, people don't know how to use it. You really, really need to document how this gets used. And I think it's been written about in various ways, but a quick sort of summary of it is that it's worse to have perfect code with no documentation than it is to have really, really average code with great documentation, because at least the average code with great documentation is going to get used because people aren't going to be afraid to try it out. And then they can help you make improvements. If there's no documentation, it'll never get used. And you'll be back to having 60 different SVGs, and it'll be sad. So for the rest here, we want to talk about the strategies you can use to manage those scary obstacles while working to achieve the happy path. Aww. One more time. Aww. All right, so we're on to part 3. No one's left yet. Kind of surprised. Okay. We're going to talk about the implementation and the strategies involved to maximize the things that go well, minimize the things that go poorly. Start with frameworks, and we're also going to look at least a little bit of code. So the primary thing that I think working within frameworks does really well with is managing the fear of this is going to require significant buy-in. I think the reason frameworks are really good at this is because you can meet people where they are. And so, so we've got what I'll sort of selfishly call the big 3 right now. Mostly it's obviously a ton of React here, a lot of Angular. And just because this is a talk at a front-end thing, we have to do this where we talk about what's more popular. It's really unimportant right now, but it was really cool because it's a blue, it's a reddish-orange, it's a green. Those happen to be the colors that NPM uses for its download chart. And so I just thought it was cool that the colors happen to work out. That's the only reason this is here. It doesn't matter what you're using as long as you can have some agreement within your team on one. All of these will work well for sharing code. So I think the primary reason, that frameworks are great for encouraging buy-in is that if your team or your company has chosen that you're going to be using Angular, and it's the type of developers that you're hiring, it's people with Angular experience, and it's the type of projects that you're working on, all using a component library means in that case is instead of importing from some relative path right next to you, a component nearby, you do npm install at my company component library, and then you just import the component that you want. And it's that simple, which is why I think working within the frameworks that are already being used at your company is a huge benefit. Yeah?
I just did this week, and I can say from personal experience, I don't know I would say that it is that easy. So I hope you'll talk about build processes, because that is
Yes, certainly. What framework working with it? Okay, cool. Yes, I will talk about at least a little bit some of the difficulties you'll run into. Unfortunately, my professional experience is Vue, and so I'll talk about how Vue solves that problem, build processes, and then I'll wish you the best of luck. with the React one. So if you can meet people where they are, and obviously there can be setup involved. If you can meet people where they're working, then there's a low contribution barrier, which is another really huge thing. It's why open source projects succeed, is if people feel comfortable contributing when they come across an issue and don't feel totally scared to ever say anything. You need people to, when they see an issue with your component library, to be able to contribute. And you have an ecosystem of tools that go along with your framework and an ecosystem of examples. So we're going to take, this is now the scary part, we're going to look at some actual code, but I think we're doing okay time-wise. First, let's take just a quick look at what Clarity is. And we're just going to look at their public-facing site here, what they give people coming to the component library. Both of these examples, Clarity and Polaris from Shopify, are fantastic documentation. And so this is, if you have infinite time, this is something that we can aspire to. They list out their components here. This is something I'll mention as a tip in just a bit, I think. But I really like that the list of components they give you is super flat because it encourages you to look through the whole thing. Again, it's all about findability in the same way that business-minded folk would talk about, and now I don't actually remember how they phrase it, but like the moment, like the decision moment when you're going to do something, you want your product to be available to the person at the moment they're going to decide. So that's why like you want to be on Google Maps, because that's where they're going to be searching. It's like, where do I get Thai food after this? Bow tie. In the same way, you want your shared components to be available when someone thinks, I need a select. And so Clarity has done a really good job here of saying, here's your select. They document the way that it's going to be used in terms of the functionality that they make available, and they document these are some sample code options of put this into your project and see what works. So I like Clarity a lot. I think my critique is that there's some kind of inconsistency with how they expect you to use this, in that some of it is just CSS focused, whereas some of it's actual Angular components that you can import. I think it was an intentional decision that they made to try to use the simplest approach available. But I would argue it's really important to keep consistent usage to try to make things a component when they make sense as a component. Okay, so that's the Angular approach, or one of the Angular approaches. We'll look real quick at Polaris, and we're going to go more into the Polaris code in a little bit. But I love their documentation here. They have a slightly less flat structure, but they've done a really good job of organizing things. And especially what they've done in terms of auto-generating documentation is really fantastic. So I'm on a choice list. They show me some of the main ways that you would use a choice list, and I can select them to see what that looks like, including it looks like adding an option. I get the code for that. I can edit it in a sandbox. I can see what it is in just HTML, which they actively recommend against because they want you using the React version, which has more functionality. But I think the goal here is if someone's coming to Shopify and they really, really don't want to use a build process, you can get at least some of the benefits just using HTML and CSS. And then something that I really want to harp on for your documentation is that you really want to document both a kind of long form summary of this is the philosophy and this is how to use it, and you really want to make it obvious what properties and events are available on your component. And so these are auto-generated. That's some of the code that I'm most excited about having discovered. Polaris they've done a fantastic job at using TypeScript and TSX to auto-generate really helpful code about how do I use this. Finally, we're going to look at just a subset of what we have at Politico. Has anyone ever heard of the podcast Front End Happy Hour?
Yes.
Cool. Their most recent episode, which I discovered I think on Tuesday, happened to be about component libraries. It was really great, and that's just this talk. I'm just quoting them the whole time. They pointed out that Legos are a great analogy for what a component library is, which made me feel great because that's the decision we had when we renamed ours. It used to be Politico Design System. We needed to rename it. Someone said, it's like Legos. We're like, that's perfect. And the part that didn't make me feel great is one of the hosts said, yeah, I think most companies that I've talked to, that's the name of their component library system. It's like, okay. I felt unique. But we're going to look at it briefly. For now, rather than going too much into the code for Legos itself, we're going to look at how we use it. And this is, to your point, I think the most important thing is once we've set up the build process for Legos, the library, to export, in our case, compiled components. And we can look at that script a little bit. It's something that Vue makes very easy because they give you the option, instead of building to target production, you can build to target a library. And what that means is I tell Vue which components I'm interested in exporting, and it does the web packing for importing dependencies, exporting compiled JavaScript that then is what's hosted on npm. So when I install it in any library, it doesn't matter that I've gotten all the code or that all the code was in the same order or same relative position to its dependencies, because Webpack has already handled that, and it's just JavaScript that I'm importing. And so that, I think, was a big step for us in our build process, was getting Lego set up to export compiled components. And so now, and I'm going to start shouting, now at the time that I want to use Legos, I have this base Vue app. It's just the Vue, can everyone see this roughly? It's just Vue CLI. I create an app. It includes TypeScript. And I want to make use of our Legos project. We call it Politico Vue Components. So take a look here at the package. It's been installed as a dependency, and I just want to go to the hello world and attempt live coding and see how this goes. So the part that I was talking about why I think it matters so much to meet your teams where they are in terms of frameworks is because what I'm going to do here is just import the exact same way that I would be importing from any other either directory in my application or any other external library from npm. I just target the npm package. I want to do the icon. Let's import the icon. Like I said, this is one of the things we've been happiest about, is how easy this icon has made our lives. So I've imported it. In Vue, you have to declare which components you're interested in using for whatever file you're in. And now I'm ready to go into my template. In Vue, we have these single file templates. And so Vue has an area for you to write your HTML templates. You have an area for your script and an area for your CSS. So I'm just going to Politico icon this. Another great thing about trying to document and name things correctly is that VS Code at this point is just incredible with knowing what you want. It's a really great preview of like 5 to 10 years from now when we won't have jobs because whatever, like it'll just do this thing. And I'm going to set up I'm going to set up the name that I want, and in this case it's going to be calendar. And that should be it. The goal here is that usage is as simple as possible and as close to your expectations, like we were talking about with documentation, that it works the way I would expect it to. And so we had lots of conversations about what is a good way to declare an icon and how should it be handled and what interface should we expose to someone. And so here we go. We have the calendar. In just a little bit, I'll go into how we would develop this calendar, but I also know that there are additional props that we've made available. So we have a height prop, and we have a width prop. Cool. And we save, and we reload, and cool. This is working as we'd expect. And this is what we'd hope for people who come to our Politico View Components library, is that they can get what they need. And they can get what they need, and it works the way that they would expect it to. And in just a minute or two, we'll look at the way that they can find out information. Finally, some quick tips about working with frameworks here. Like I've said, pick what's already being used by your team, so that there's as little friction as possible. Leverage the library. So this was the build process. In our case, Vue CLI, the fact that they had thought about compiling the components in advance so that they could be imported as just standard JavaScript into your project was huge. And so that's the way we leverage our library. Now might actually be a good time. I'd be interested in, for React, was the biggest problem exporting components and expecting them to work and them not working, or setting up your kind of consuming project to build correctly?
I mean, I guess it's important to first disclaimer that it was like, I had no idea.
Oh, yeah.
So I guarantee there's a better way to do it. I'll let Mark speak to that. But for me, the hardest part was getting the compiled code to be importable in the way that like the build process of the importing project was expecting the code to be. So compiling it down to something that wasn't going to interfere with the web pack process on the other side wasn't inherently straightforward. I mean, I ultimately solved it today, so that we can scare them away.
Mm-hmm.
Sure, again, something is way ahead.
But I think that's part of it, is like figure out something that works first so you can try it out, and then start optimizing. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. If possible, I'd recommend that you stick to the component principles that we've talked about a little bit. Incredibly important, don't rely on external state. And now I'm gonna slide in the fact that I don't really know hooks well. But I imagine that'll be a very important part if you're working with React, and maybe other libraries in the future, is considering, do hooks fit into my shared component library, and how do I want my shared components to interact with state? But the thing that I'd really caution you against with shared components is it's really hard to document that. It's really hard to document this thing is expecting some global state or some global approach to state to be available. And so as much as possible, I think I and many people would still recommend you pass in props to make your component work, you watch events, and that should be pretty much it. You should just be able to drop it in and do those two things. Ideally, you wouldn't rely on external CSS to make your component look the way you're expecting it to. So the approaches you have available, CSS modules to apply only to specific code. In Vue, we often use scoped CSS, where we rely on Vue to apply data attributes and say, like, this CSS, only apply it in this component, which makes our life really easy. And then something that showed up elsewhere is you want to beware of the apropscalypse. It looks better than it is to say. The apropscalypse being you don't want to create a component that only has one option initially, and then you realize I have, whatever this is, 12 different use cases. You don't want to think, I have 12 different use cases, and so I'll just add 12 different properties, because that makes this almost impossible to understand when I'm initially looking at it. I have no idea what all those things are, and I'd really rather not worry about them when I just want to do one simple thing. The ways that you can work on avoiding this, one, you can, if you have, say it happens to work out really well where like this thing is all grouped together, and this is only going to be considered for one version of block component, right? Maybe that group of properties is mostly relevant if your block component is a header. Then you can still, if you want to, you can have this private block component that has your base level stylings. You can keep that in your shared component library, so long as you feel you understand it well, and what you expose to the user is just 4 properties, and that's for your header block component, something like that, where you want to make the interface that people have to interact with your components as simple as possible and as well documented as possible. I would also encourage, every time you're thinking about adding a new property, One, make sure if possible there's a sensible default. Like if 80% of people are going to have this without experiment, for example, this with experiment, then obviously with experiment the default should be false, and you should only pass that in if you really need to. So hopefully that's one way that you can encourage people to not worry about it. And then I would encourage pushing back on whether you need that property at all. If there's if there's a way that other properties logically cohere together, this just becomes an architecture problem. Software is hard, reuse is hard, but you don't want to end up here. Cool. All right, so we're doing well time-wise. We're on to the second potential obstacle that we want to avoid, which is friction when modifying your component library and the difficulties that you'll run into, because lots of people will be using it. You won't always know exactly how people are going to be using it, and you want to be able to make changes in a consistent way, in a usable way. You don't want to be stuck. You don't want it to be hard to develop in your shared component library, because then people won't make changes. So the solution here is Storybook. Lots of people have used React. Who's used Storybook? Cool, awesome. It's basically a standalone, a user interface for developing components where you ensure that each component can be developed in isolation rather than as part of an application. This is the default view of Storybook, and we're going to take a look at this. What's happening here is for Legos, for our shared component library. We have the Politico icon, and we're able to modify properties here in the interface and see the way that it affects the actual application. And then really nice, one of the add-ons available to Storybook is that I get the generated code, or for what I'm typing in here, I can just get what I need to copy and paste into my application. For more complex components, that's really great, is to be able to see exactly how this is going to look when I set these properties. And once it's the way I want it to look, then I can just copy and paste that in. And obviously add dynamic properties as you're working in your application. But the thing that Storybook is really good at is having these add-ons available, having documentation, a documentation add-on, and having a way, to navigate around all the components that you have available. So let's take a look. Oops. Let's take a look at how that looks for Legos first, and then we'll look at an extremely impressive version, which is Polaris, Spotify's Storybook instance. All right, so here we are in Legos. This is the repository for the shared component library, and we're going to npm run Storybook. We have a couple different commands associated with Legos, and the two major ones are a way to, with Legos, the two major ones are a way to run storybooks so that I can develop locally the components in isolation. And then we have commands to publish, so to build the library in a way that's going to be consumable by other projects, and to run our tests, and we need to be able to do that both locally and at the time that we publish to NPM. So this is what it looks like when we're using it. I've just picked three here to highlight for now. We have a drop down that shows you this is the way it's going to work, and this is to make this happen. This is roughly the code that you would be using. You'd pass in items, and a really nice thing about Storybook is that it can read. It started as a React project, but there have been ports of it essentially, or plugins that make it available for Angular and for Vue, and it can read the props that you have available for your component, tell you which ones are required, tell you what the sensible defaults that have been set are, and what types are expected to go in there. And like I was showing in that animation with the icon, we have a way to try out different icons here and see what they look like, and then we also iterate through all our available SVGs to see, mostly this is the way that you'd be interacting with it. You'd come here and say, I need this icon, is it available yet? And so we try to make it as easy as possible for people to find out, is it available yet? And finally we have this loading block, which is one of the, in some ways a functionality, which is that we just pass it a Boolean, are you loading right now? and then we handle the animation within this component. So at the time that you want to show a loading block on your page, you don't have to worry about how do I animate it or what icons do I use. So this is 3 really super simple cases of how you might interact with Storybook. One thing that I really liked doing in general, as I'm trying to understand how other people have done this, Polaris has their entire repository available, and so you can fork it and try it out. And so this is their repository, and this is what it's dev. This is what it looks like when you run their version of Storybook, and it's impressive. They have many. I want to say in the 30s. Components available for you to play with, and they have them really well organized. And they don't use Storybook as much for their documentation. It's primarily for their development. Whereas the site that that we looked at, I should say, this site is primarily where people would come to look at how do I use it. But if you want to develop and make changes, you get to see this is the badge component. Here's what a default badge looks like. This is the autocomplete. And I'll go back real quick. So in Legos, when we're doing this, when it comes time to make changes to our components, and we've talked about the icon, so I'll look at the icon. When it comes time to make changes, for example, instead of allowing someone to determine the color, if I want to make it, I believe this is blue. If I want to make the icons always blue, I can do that and see what it's going to look like. This is really important for you while you're developing and making changes, is that you have a standalone place, that you don't need to test this in the project where it's going to be used, that you can do most of your development within Storybook. And so I think that's the primary benefit that we want to be aware of, is that we need this ability to develop in isolation without any external dependencies and see how it looks. So that encourages that mindset. We get the plugin ecosystem for documentation and for tests. We get a usable UI. You do npm install Storybook and you run Storybook, and as soon as you start adding, they call them stories, saying this is the component I want here and please give me documentation based on the properties, and I'll write a little summary. Those stories just display. You can obviously modify or style Storybook as you see fit. And I think really key for any team is that your design team will probably still, I think in most people's experience, still have Sketch or a similar tool as their sort of source of truth, or maybe not source of truth, but primary place that they go for assets. If they're gonna mock something out, Sketch is a great place for them to keep materials or a similar product. For them to keep materials when they're about to design a new UI. But if any designer or developer wants to see what is currently available to us and how we can modify it and what properties are available, they can go to Storybook. And so we can go to our internal Storybook URL, or we can point people to, hey, check out this story, see what you think. Let me know if there are issues. So I think having a central place where people go to look and a central place where people can experiment is really important. Some very basic tips. Oops. You want to make it as easy to find as possible. That's why I'd recommend, for as long as you can, a flat directory structure. You'll notice that even, so Polaris has some nesting on their public site, but here it's all flat. And so I can just search through and filter and see what's available without too much issue. You want to always publish and test locally. So you develop in Storybook, but then you always want to test locally in a consuming project. We'll talk about how you do that. And you want to utilize the plugins as much as possible. Cool. This is one of my favorite tweets. I think it summarizes a lot of frustration that I typically wouldn't have, or before I joined a team with deadlines for their development, I typically wouldn't have worried about this. And if I said premature optimization is the root of, can anyone come up? All evil? Yes, all evil. Someone's premature optimization is the root of all evil. Someone said that to me initially, and I felt very confused. It was like, no, we always want to make it as well as we can. We want to think about how it's going to be used before we just randomly start typing away. That seems wrong. But you realize that there's a lot of truth to it. If you're guessing how something is going to be used without real insight into that, you're just guessing, and it's tough to design the right solution. And so oftentimes the right solution is only knowable after you've done the same thing 3 times. And so that's another quote from a well-known computer sciencey person. And if you go look up this quote, 3 strikes and you refactor, it says Martin Fowler quoting Don Roberts. And so the obvious solution is then, like, obviously, come on, I'm sure Michael quoted it at some point. But I think this is something that's probably worth following as you develop your component library. I would say there are a couple exceptions to don't share it first. So don't share it first, meaning develop the component where it's going to be used initially, and only share it after you realize that you have to. I would say that is the default. The lead on my team at Politico has been really, really good about enforcing and encouraging that. Like, we don't need to share this yet. We only have the one instance. We may think we need it in the future, but if we never need it in the future and it only is ever used in this one place, it was pointless to do it, to spend the time on it. And it's just going to confuse people because they're going to feel really hesitant about deleting it from the component library or making changes to it once it's there. I'd say the exceptions are at the beginning. You want to try this out, and the reason that you're trying out a component library is because we all raised our hands for those frustrations. We have scattered code, we have duplicated code, we have inconsistent code. We all raised our hands for that, so there's a reason that you're interested in the component library, and so pick a few things that you already know. This would be so helpful if I didn't have to write a select every time that I wanted to select an option, or write a multi-select. Pick the things that you're already using, and work on getting buy-in for that, but use it on the 2 or 3 products where you need it, and get something started so that you can iterate on it. I would say it's later when you have a new interface, and you say, oh, this progress bar, this is the first time I'm seeing it, but it looks really nice, and so I'd like it to be shareable in case anyone else wants it. Don't do it in case anyone else wants it. Do it because someone else wants it, and that allows you to often make more of the right choice architecturally. Okay. Any questions at the moment? Yeah, please. Please.
How do you know that someone else wants it? How do they know it exists in the first place if you haven't shared it?
That is a fantastic question. The thing that would allow a component library, at least in my somewhat limited experience, to snowball is that people start to understand that this is where I should go first to look. And so that also influences designers, right? So for any given interface, there's going to be 15 different things that could be broken into components, and often it's an entire team's job to keep track of what is our brand, what things are we using, but it can be designers and developers to know that, like, we've never had a progress bar, but we're about to have 2 or 3 different apps with progress bars. Or, I think much more likely, we had a progress bar that one time. We have to do another progress bar. Let's go back and look at how that worked last time and see if it makes sense now to make it shareable. And so you add work by doing this. You add work to retrofit the one that was developed originally, because it wasn't developed to be in the shared component library, and so it didn't have the build process, and maybe it has dependencies on external state. So you add work to go refactor that, but you avoid the case of creating something that's not going to fit your use case later. So I would say that's, one option is you, as a team, you know the direction that you're going, and you know we're about to have 3 of these. Or I think more likely, it's about time to build this new product and We know that we've done something very similar previously, but let's see if we can do it a little bit better and make it work in those cases. Does that make sense? Cool. So we're going to talk now a little bit about the challenges of versioning. And NPM really is the front-end solution to versioning challenges. And I think this was the biggest, when we got started, this was the biggest source of imposter syndrome for me, which was like, NPM is what like real developers use. Like I go grab their stuff. I don't want to mess with putting my stuff there, like my stuff doesn't deserve to be there. I still feel that sometimes. But all NPM is instead of a Git repository, where master, developer, whatever your branch is always the latest authoritative version of your code. NPM allows you to say, this at this point in time was the authoritative version of my code. This is what people were using. This is version 2.1.1. And it's not going to go away. So if someone still wants to use 2.1.1, they can use that version. And so that's really, really key for a component library, because no longer is it just going to be you making use of these, making use of this code, but it's also going to be other people, and you want it to still work for them without coordinating all the time. Hey, is it okay if we make this change now? So that's all that NPM is going to allow us to do. The reason you'd want to use it is because what we talked about there. The consuming projects, they need to be able to control which version they're getting. Importantly for us, it fits into our current workflow as front-end developers. We're already downloading lots of packages. And so if you can put your package or set up a workflow where your package will publish to NPM, then it's just another thing that you install. NPM install your package. And then it encourages the hard conversations regarding versioning. And we'll get to that a little bit. I want to show real quick the process of publishing. I'm going to look at publishing locally. And the reason this is required is because I'm developing in our Legos repository, but I need to use that code and test that code over in my other application. So we have, this is in Legos, right? We just made our change to the Politico icon component. We made it blue now. And we'd like to see how that change works in the consuming project, which is the actual thing that is going to be shipped. Obviously, you're not shipping your library. You're shipping the product that's using the library. So in this case, the product that's using the library is this this sample application, and we already have Politico icon here. We can actually see how it's currently displaying. Cool, it's still really nice and big, but it's also defaulting to whatever color it's surrounded by, and we now want our icon to always be blue. So in Legos, what we've done is we've set up a workflow to publish local. And the command here is npm run publish local. And this is something that we developed and have tweaked and continue to tweak. But essentially, we wrote a build script that's responsible for bundling, running tests, and then packing. So npm has a pack command, which is how they take the code that you've written and determine which ones will actually be packed into a zip file to be consumed by other projects. And then we go and we send that to the node modules of the project that we're interested in. So I set up my test app to be the project that we're interested in here. So I set that as my local target. So it's running tests. And now it's working on, after finishing the test, it's going to work on bundling the code in the way that the Vue CLI allows us to target a library build. And then it's going to go put that in the node modules that I've asked it to. And if we had a hot reload, it should just show up. Okay, no hot reload. Let's see if it shows up on a refresh. Yay! So I've now made the change in Storybook, and I've done all the primary development that I need to without ever worrying about the consuming project. But then before I make my pull request, I want to make sure it actually works in the situation where I'm using it. And obviously I can see this doesn't work. Blue is a terrible color choice. It's funny, it really doesn't look that blue. I swear it changed color. Yeah?
What did you do to, can we see under the hood?
Yeah, for sure. How are we doing time-wise? We're okay for now.
Mostly the real question I had there was
Yeah.
the linking to the other app.
Yeah. Two different approaches. One, NPM allows a link command where you set up a symlink. Say, hey, consuming project, my Vue project. Instead of referencing your locally installed package, I want you to reference over here this packed version of the code. Instead of doing that, we say, because we don't want to, we've decided we don't want to modify the consuming project's package JSON. We don't until we're ready to. We don't want to say like you're expecting a new version. Instead, we just want to test the version. And so what we do, sadly, this is something I'm responsible for. So if you lose all respect here, it's fine. So locally test, and we eventually, down here somewhere, I think it's here actually, we push the generated and the packed code to the targeted node modules. And so we use the name of the package, and we use, it's set up in this local config. We use the absolute path. So this is just something that our developers, they set up once when they clone Legos for the first time. They set up like, this is where my various packages or projects are located. So what that allows us to do is know this is packed exactly the way that NPM will pack it, and we get to test it without modifying the package JSON. And we don't have to worry about symlinks. I think symlinks are also a very valid solution to that problem. Cool. Sweet. Okay, we're getting close to the end here. The last step after this is going to be to talk about TypeScript and documentation, which I'm very excited about because the TypeScript and documentation for the Shopify library is really fantastic. The last things to keep in mind for NPM. You want, as much as possible, to have tests. This is the same as any other software development and front-end development. Especially important if you can, to test anything that's purely functional, like accept one input, output one output. You want to unit test those things, and that's super manageable. Jest or Mocha makes that very easy. Whether you do it just the JavaScript file that contains that logic, or if you want to test, if you want to mount the component and test the results. If you're using Storybook, one of the plugins that's available is StoryShot. And StoryShot has a visual regression test option where it will, the first time you run it, take screenshots of all your components in isolation. It'll run a headless Chrome, so it'll get screenshots of what your components look like when they're rendered. And then each time you make a change and commit, you set up CI or continuous deployment, and each time those tests run, it'll compare what do the components look like now to what did they look like before. The main thing that you might find useful is you want to make sure that with the same inputs, the component isn't suddenly 3 times bigger, because that's a really, in my not fully experienced opinion, but like when a backend developer modifies an API, there's a way to test, is the API the same? You can just point out, like, does it have the same inputs when I make a request to it, and for the same inputs, will it output the same thing? For front-end shared code, it is a little bit harder in that it's really tough to test if something's going to look exactly the same on the page without knowing all the places that it's going to be used. And so one thing that I'd recommend StoryShot for is if something, if positioning left to right changes, that won't break the things around it. But if a component is suddenly 3 times bigger or 2 times smaller or has dramatically different margins around it, that will break the places it's being used. So that's why StoryShot can be useful. At the outset, I would recommend iterating early and often and versioning fairly regularly, because you're going to be making a lot of early changes to get this started, and you want to encourage people to feel comfortable making changes. But as the pace slows, consider what your philosophy is going to be for versioning as you make changes. And the next slide, who wants to explain what semantic versioning is? Does anyone want to take that one? Yeah.
I will attempt to.
Please.
So, in semantic versioning, you have the major number, which is to the very left, that's your major version. You have the dot, and then the middle number, which is your minor version. You have another dot, and you have the last number, which is your hash.
That's fantastic. I think that's a clap. That was really good. And that's what this is. So you want to talk about your philosophy for major, minor / feature, and fix or patch versions, and when you'll do each. It is probably unrealistic for every time that like something will have slightly changed for padding to do a major version, but in theoretical semantic versioning, that would be the goal. Is that for as long as you're doing patch, which are fixes like something is definitely wrong, or minor features where you're adding a new feature, for as long as you're doing that, new projects should be able to confidently say like, okay, I'm getting that. I'll take a quick look to make sure that everything builds, but I'm okay getting that version. And it's only when you publish a major breaking one that projects have to be like, whoa, I need to rework a lot of things because I know things are going to be breaking. So those are the types of conversations you want to have with your team. And it's difficult, but implementing those things like publishing to NPM, when you make a patch version is a nice thing to be able to do automatically, for example. Real quick, I'm not going to show the process to publish all the way to NPM right now, partly because for Politico, hold on, I'm going to set this down. For Politico, we use an enterprise version of NPM. And so that's how we have private packages in our case. There's lots of different versions with NPM for how you want to handle private packages. Oops. Cool. I just wanted to take a quick look at, for Polaris, what does their version history look like? Because there's a lot going on here. So they are currently, you can see their latest is 3.9. This is actually kind of inaccurate and something they'll probably want to fix with their tagging. You can plan on having, you can tag your releases, and this is all stuff you can kind of look up as you start to get more familiar with NPM versioning, but you can tag different releases. So if someone says, I always want the latest version, but I don't want a beta version, that's one way to do so, is to tag it as next rather than latest. And there's a lot here in terms of going from a major version 1 to a major version 2. And so you would expect that from 2 to 3, there were a lot of breaking changes because they realized, hey, these things that we were doing, they're not working. We have to make changes so that we can keep growing. Okay, the very last thing that we're going to talk about is TypeScript and documentation, and how. Oh, I'm so sorry. Yeah.
How would you define like a beta version and like a minor version? So like we're using NPM for a lot of our libraries these days, so kind of figuring this out. So if we have a bug fix that comes in, we can tag it as beta. And how do you determine like when it's ready to go on with the beta? Or how do you do that?
Interesting. Yeah. What we actually did for a little bit was we published each time we made a change locally, we published a beta version to then pull down and test, and we realized you definitely don't want to do that. You're polluting the list of what's available as published things for people. My initial the way that we're handling it right now, which is just one of many approaches, is that we will version based on whether it's a new feature or a bug fix, and so we'll do a patch or a minor, but then we're expecting our consuming projects to not be automatically consuming the latest version. We're forcing people to manually bump to say, like, this is the one that I want, and I run it and the thing works. And so I think at a larger scale, there's a chance that for every change you would say, for every change that you feel iffy about, maybe, right? Then there's the chance of tagging it as an alpha. If you're saying that all my consuming projects, yeah, go ahead. Like, just get whatever the latest viable option is. For us, we don't feel comfortable, I guess, with our testing or our CI/CD process yet to automatically accept that. And so we want at least one developer to have consumed, to have said, like, yep, I tested it out, I got the latest version, you know, I got the patch version, and the project builds, and just go ahead with that. For us, the beta approaches would truly be, if we were going to go back to that, it's because we were about to make a major shift, and so we'd be working on those as a beta, where projects could choose to target that. If that makes sense? No, that was a little bit roundabout. Okay, so we're going to do the TypeScript thing real quick. And mostly I'm just excited to show off how Polaris has handled TypeScript in their project and what it allows them to do for documentation. So in the same way that I did a base Vue app, I now have a base React app. This was just create React app, and as of very recently, create React app allows you to -- TypeScript, which is awesome. So the code here that was generated for me is TypeScript, and it's TSX, so the TypeScript version of JSX. I have installed Shopify Polaris, so it's just npm install. I think actually with create React app it was yarn. And I have these nice commented out things, so I'm going to try to duplicate these real quick. When I start the application, it's going to be the standard React app with the spinning React logo. And what I want to add now is a badge component from Polaris. And so I get the wonderful VS Code autocomplete here. I'm just going to use a badge component. I'm not getting any issues here, so I'm just going to see what happens. Cool, I have this tiny little thing, which is obviously not fully what I want. So let's do some text inside my badge. Great, it's working well. But if I want to change the color, maybe I've been on the Polaris website and I've been looking at the badge, but just while I'm using it, I start typing, and because it's written in TypeScript, because it's written in TSX, I know what props are available on this component. And the reason I'm so excited about this is because we don't have this with our Legos project. Vue is a little bit harder to make work with TypeScript and with template code. And so interacting with this, for me, is crazy and immensely useful, because now I know that this status property, I know what it accepts. And so I can say status equals success, and I can save, and I know as long as it compiles that that was an expected value, and indeed that turned it green. In the same way, if I say stats, because maybe that's what I thought, the fact that you can get information about property stats does not exist on is kind of crazy, and if I save, we get a compile time error. The thing that's so huge about this is that we were talking about breaking changes. This means that you don't have to, and obviously there's a debate in the front-end community about how much you want to rely on TypeScript, but this is something that will break your CI build in a very good way without you writing any tests for it. Because if the TypeScript doesn't compile, it knows that something's wrong, and it's not going to let your build compile. And so when we go and look at this, we get this warning that, hey, this isn't okay. If I want to show, I'm just going to uncomment this for now. I want to show this link, which has some confusing text, and say I know I'm supposed to surround the link with this tooltip so that I can give some information about it. TypeScript is going to tell me that tooltip is missing a required property, which is content. And so that's how Shopify has chosen to notify us that for this to work correctly, you need content, and you need to set it to some explanation. And when I do that and save, it'll compile successfully, and I get this thing that Shopify has created that I've imported in my project, other great stuff about having TypeScript in TSX, is that if I then want to see how is this tooltip implemented, I do the go to definition, and all of a sudden I'm in my node modules and I get to see the TypeScript definition for this component. I would highly recommend I'll make sure this presentation is available. This is the one link that I would highly recommend playing around with. It's just a joy. These are just basic summaries of why it's worthwhile to use TypeScript in documentation and how that's going to be a huge part of your project. So the overview now, you need significant buy-in. I would recommend frameworks as one way to improve buy-in, is meeting people where they are. You're going to have friction when modifying. I'd recommend Storybook for developing in isolation. You're going to have versioning challenges. I'd recommend NPM and getting to know what your different versioning and semantic versioning strategies are. And then you need excellent documentation, and I can't recommend TypeScript enough, especially for a project like this. And then using documentation and JS docs. So that brings us back to the happy path, the stuff that we're trying to go towards. And that is it. Thank you so much for your time. Did we want to wrap up, or time for a couple questions? Cool. Time for 2 questions, if anyone has any. Yeah.
So I'm a designer working with our development team to build our component library. And I was wondering if you had any tips about that relationship. I think you touched on it a little bit.
Yeah.
Sketch and using Storybook and all that, but if you could like maybe break that down a bit more and like throw out some like lessons learned.
Yeah. One big lesson learned for us is that it really helps to pick the same terminology. And so if you have in Sketch, is it a partial or a module? If you like, symbols, if you have something that's as simple as, maybe a button, to go back to buttons, or a select versus a multi-select versus a drop-down or things like that, to pick the same terminology so that your symbols map to the components, and you can say, I've made changes to this. This is the component that needs to be changed. So I'd say that's really good for when you're continuing to work. In terms of getting started, I just, it's a lame answer, but communication all the time. So that you have both developers and designers involved when a given UI is going to be developed. So that you can talk about, we know these are going to be the easy things and these are the things that already exist. And then all having a centralized place to look at for what components are. Any other very quick question? Question about favorite colors? Yeah.
So how would you implement Storybook in your code? Is it a separate app, or is it in your main app?
Yeah, it's a really good question. You can implement Storybook on any application. If you have, say, you have your product that you're shipping, it's an inventory management, and you realize that there are certain components in that product that you want to test on their own, and you want to make sure they work on their own, you can just add Storybook to that. It lives next to, but doesn't affect your code at all. It's just for development. The way we implemented it in our code is that Legos itself, the shared component library, which is I think how it would work for most people, it doesn't have an application where it's working together, serving some functionality. And so the only thing that we're doing is we're running Storybook. We install it from NPM. You can, in any documentation of Storybook or any other shared component library, you can see how you write stories, which just says import this component, give it these properties, add this documentation. And so it just becomes, for that repository, it becomes the way that you view the code. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Cool. All right. Thank you so much, everyone. Really appreciate it.